Welcome back to a foggy day on Olympus. We're so excited to see everybody. This is where we are having grown up discussions for grown up people here on Mount Olympus, the place where the Greek gods would have lived. And so we are attempting to give our Olympian judgment on all matters of history, religion, and culture. My name is Coel Campo.
And I'm Mike Pierce, and today we're starting a brand new series that we're calling Fighting Free of God, because that's so much more exciting a title than secularization. But that is what we're going to be looking at during the course of this series. And most people will expect, and certainly anybody who's religious, I suppose, would expect us to look at molecular intellectual phenomena like modernist ideologies, Enlightenment ideas, nationalism, socialism, Darwin and changes in science, biblical criticism, and we're going to be doing all of those things. But we're starting off by looking at something that's a different kind of phenomenon that is in many ways, I would argue, and indeed most academics take this kind of view, more important, even more important than the things I just mentioned. And that is the changes in the way that we live, which cause all of us, even people who think of themselves as committed Christians, to live highly secular lives, whether we want to or not. So we're calling this first episode, Is God Now Severely Underemployed?
I love this title as the employment rates in the US are going up and down and mostly down, and God is just he's along right there with everybody else experiencing the same struggles as the common folk.
I'm not quite sure that's what's meant, but I'm impressed that you like this expression because it is taken, of course, from your favourite college reading, Patricia Crone's Pre-Industrial Society.
If we could do a single series without a reference to Patricia Crone, I will be shocked.
Yes, and probably delighted, but I'm too mean to let that happen to you. So we have to keep
Of
going
course.
back to her in a way. Just to let viewers in on our private joke here, many moons ago, Coel took an honours programme in Houghton College, which I was leading, and to read an awful lot of stuff, and some of it they loved, particularly a novel we'll be looking at a number of episodes from now, I guess. But Patricia Crone's book, Pre-Industrial Societies, which I think is amazing, the students really didn't like. Can you remind me why they didn't like this? Why was it? Because it so abstract or something like that? Or...
I think it was a little too abstract for the bright-eyed freshman
Right.
coming into college.
Yes. I suppose she was calling on knowledge of a whole wide range of different societies, which the students at that stage just didn't have. Maybe that was it. Yes.
Yeah.
She was primarily, I say was because sadly she died a number of years ago. She was primarily a historian of the Muslim world. She branched out in this book to talk about elements that pre-modern societies have in common. And in my view, she does just an amazing job. Concerning religion, she says that it's not that science disproves religion, the sort of the old trope coming from the late 19th, early 20th centuries, but that it sidelines final cause in favour of proximate cause, making God incrementally functionally irrelevant.
Okay, so I'm okay with final cause and proximate cause, but let's not lose any viewers this early on in our episode.
Okay, well, final cause would in most scenarios, I guess, refer to God. What is it that finally is the cause of the phenomena that we see around us in our lives? Right, and the proximate cause is the thing that's right next to it. Let's take a trivial example. The proximate cause of the water in my kettle boiling so that I can make some coffee is that the electricity was flowing through the wires and it caused the water to boil. Right, The final cause would be, let us say, my decision that I want some coffee and deciding to flick the button. In this sense, God is the final cause of everything. And her point is that science sidelines that by getting us to focus constantly on proximate cause. It's not that she herself was a religious believer. I'm almost certain that she wasn't. But that's not the point. She's just looking at how the process works. So if you do that enough for long enough, then what you're doing stage by stage is making God more and more functionally irrelevant. He doesn't come into our calculations about what we're going to do next or how we ought to do something. So science and scholarship, she says, have indeed caused religion to decline in the West, which is the general and popular view, not so much because their conclusions run counter to the Bible or Christian dogma, a subject we'll be taking up in a later episode, but rather because they made God severely underemployed. Any member of modern society endowed with minimal intelligence is aware of the fact that scientists successfully explain and manipulate the natural world without reference to God. And that's not saying even that all scientists disbelieve in God. Many of them do believe in God. But that's not what's driving along their scientific explanations, and that's her point.
Right. So, like, the classic example of this is the weather, right? In that people used to call upon the gods to try to influence the weather, but now we scientifically know how to predict what's going to happen, and so we don't necessarily need animal sacrifices anymore to get the outcomes that we want.
Right. Yes. Yes. That would be another classic example, right? We focus on proximate cause of the. I'm going to quickly get out of my depth here. Wind currents in the upper atmosphere, or something like that. And if you know far more about science than I do, please spare us comments in the comment box, except maybe consolatory ones for my stupidity here. But that's the kind of thing that gets focused on, rather than, yes, as you say, looking for final causes of what's driving all of this. Okay, well, let's come now to a Christian commentator on this, making the same general point, not just about science, but about social processes. Os Guinness has been active for many decades now. I think he was an acolyte of Francis Schaeffer, whom we referred to a few episodes ago, back in the 1970s. He's still alive and writing, but this is from one of his not his earliest book, but his earlier ones, looking at this process. And he says, as modernization drives forward, more and more of what was formerly left to God or human initiative and the processes of nature is classified, calculated, and controlled by the use of reason. When reason has harnessed all the facts, figures, and forces, divine intervention is as unwelcome as accident. Divine law as antiquated as the divine right of kings. Human spontaneity becomes the human factor, the weak link in the chain of procedures. And wonder, along with humility and the sanctity of things, is totally out of place. It's not that practical reason is irreligious, but that in more and more areas of life, religion is practically irrelevant.
So Guinness is saying here that even for believers, the way that we live now makes our lives more secular. Like, we're putting God into a box marked Sunday mornings only.
Well, that is, yeah, that's basically where he's taking us, which is a rather worrying thought, because for maybe for us and for many of our viewers who might think of themselves as Christians, that is in some ways all too true, right? That religious calculations don't necessarily come into an awful lot of the things that we do. Famously, perhaps notoriously, this is true in the workplace. And a number of Christian ministries, I'm thinking in particular here of my friend Mark Green, have spent their lives exhorting Christians to live out their faith in the workplace and apply it there. But the same thing could be true of, our shopping habits or all these kinds of more mundane things. Yeah, that's right. The lives even of believers are increasingly secularized simply by living a modern style of life and the way that that works. Yes. Okay, well, wealth and security have the same effect, and here I just want to step in here, I suppose, as a historian and remind us of how most people before us have lived. People who live their short lives, only a bad harvest or an enemy raid away from death, tend to look to the heavens, or perhaps just a superstition, for security. And we don't live like that mostly, though the way the world's going now, maybe some of these things are going to return, but let's see. Um, and so we don't feel that kind of compulsion. But even today, I mean, the favourite line of military chaplains, as they like to point out, looking after the usually moderately rough lads under their care in the army, their constant refrain is, "There are no atheists in foxholes," right? So when you're staring death in the face, there's not many atheists there, and that's a perfectly valid point. Wars and disastrous events, think, for example, of 9/11 or COVID-19, these see sharp upward ticks, usually only temporary, in religious attendance and or observance. I mean, this is one thing I've seen at first hand in this part of the world in the aftermath, well, the later stages, which is all I saw, and the immediate aftermath of the wars of the 1990s. The Catholic churches were full. The congregations were literally spilling out onto the street. You don't see that now. So it's, again, wars and disastrous events push us that way. So sociologically, atheism counts as a luxury belief.
Ooh, I think that's gonna sting some people.
Well, good. Let it sting, because, as you know, and I'm sure by now our viewers know, I'm kind of mean.
Only kind of.
Gee, thank you. Yes. Oof. Um,
Yeah, we're saying that religiosity is the human default position, right? And that atheism can only be afforded by people who are relatively wealthy.
yes, relatively wealthy, relatively comfortable, feeling pretty safe. Yes. Because Westerners live in what
Yeah.
anybody else would call luxury, even though we don't, because we don't appreciate a lot of what we've got by now. We've had it for so long. Um, they're very unwilling to see this rather obvious point. Yes.
So this is kind of going back to, unfortunately, Patricia Crone's book, that religion was one of the commonalities was one of the commonalities shared by pre-industrial societies because it was necessary to them, unlike now where we feel like we basically don't need it.
Are you beginning to see the light? Patricia Crone may have had stuff going for. Yes, exactly so. Exactly so.
She's been on my mind a lot
I'm
lately.
glad to hear it. Right.
Much to my chagrin.
There we are. Okay. Well, let's come now to a book. We're going to be dealing with a number of really famous writings in a few minutes. This book is no kind of bestseller, and to my mind is vastly underappreciated. But I found myself incredibly moved by it when I read it 15 years ago, something like that. It doesn't have a very exciting title: Christianity and Social Service in Modern Britain. I know you're already asleep, but let's just home in on what this guy has to say. He's a professor of history in London, and he argues that it was the confiscation of the church's social functions by the British state, particularly in the early 20th century, that secularized British life. And a lot of the same thing could be said of most Western countries and of all those that fell under communist rule, where, of course, churches were allowed either not to function at all, or if they were literally reduced to holding services. and that was it. His book, he realized himself, Prohaska, is so, in its implications, is so pro-Christian that he felt the need to say in the foreword or in the introduction, somewhere around there, I forget now, that he wanted to make it clear that he is not himself a religious believer. He's simply looking at the evidence of how this secularization happened. And as I say, it's an extremely moving tale because in the 19th century, most social services were run locally and by churches or religious charities. So this was true of schools and education before the advent of compulsory schooling, most of which was run by the state. Hospitals. It was true of midwives and visiting of new mothers. It was true of orphanages, help for the poor, financial, but also including housing, where that happened. Again, this was done by organizations like the YMCA and the YWCA. And the Salvation Army even ran employment bureau before there were such things, and offices to find missing persons. The point is that with all of these, the providers were local and helpers were disproportionately women. And the expansion of state bureaucracies taking over all these functions removed these services from local control and into the hands of mostly male civil servants who ran highly, and continue to run, as we all see every day, highly impersonal or depersonalized services, which depend not at all on personal relationships or local knowledge or knowledge of the individuals concerned.
Yeah, and the church and state didn't used to be so differentiated as it is now, but even still, people were used to these charitable functions having religious ties, and they were comfortable with that in the past.
Yes. Well, because their actions weren't seen as part of the state. They weren't part of the state for the most part. Arguably, in a rather slightly convoluted sense, if the provider was, say, the Church of England, or the Catholic Church in a Catholic country, but where that wasn't the case, then they're not in any sense. And of course, in the case of America, it never had. There's this time to mention exceptions here. Let's make the general point that, in general, there's never been any kind of state church in America. We will overlook the position of the Congregationalists for the first few decades after the Revolution.
Right, and so the U.S. really stayed in this sort of position much longer than Europe, and churches provided more social services and the government fewer until very recently. And do you think that's part of why America is secularizing more now rather than like 100 years ago?
Yes, that's a big part of it. I mean, there's other factors going on that we mentioned, discussions with Justin Brierley last week, but yeah, leaving that on one side, the kind of the political stuff, yes, this is really a big part of it. That the idea rather than the reality that America should be small government has meant that loads of things have continued to be provided by churches, and that now that that's being set on one side, that's doing what Patricia Crone says, it's making God severely underemployed, right?
Right.
So, and as a professor in a Catholic university in, I think, California, I was listening to just a few days ago, pointed out that churches are supposed to provide the values by which they live, but none of the service stuff, because that's all been kind of stripped away from them. And certain political forces that I must not name are talking now much more about freedom of worship rather than of religious practice. And that is code for you can do what you want in your church, mosque, synagogue for an hour a week, but outside of that, you don't bring it outside. Yeah. So that's certainly going on. Well, let's start to look at secularization theory. Please don't run away on us here, people. This is not as dry as that sounds. So, secularization theory and its discontents, because this is something that's been exercising the minds of a lot of analysts for well over 100 years now. And opinions have been changing as, of course, the times change and the situation changes. Now, we'll mention some of these as briefly as possible. Emil Durkheim is in some ways looked upon as the founder of the discipline of sociology. And he claimed that it is the sacred, not the supernatural, that's the core of all religions. Our instinct sometimes is to say, well, what do we mean by religion? Well, it entails supernaturalist beliefs. And he's saying, well, it may or it may not, but even where it does, what's really at the core of it is what human beings, what human societies consider to be sacrosanct or sacred. He says that religion is a form of collective or social consciousness, and that religion was losing its force at the time that he's writing, beginning of the 20th century, as Western societies were becoming more individualist. And of course, that's a process that's continued since his day.
Well, religion in the US and evangelicalism in all countries, I suppose, is a lot more about individual decisions and individual conversions, etc. So, does his analysis not really hold true for us?
In some ways, maybe perhaps this is part of the reason why the US was the exception in the West for a long time, and evangelicalism has kind of continued its hold, such as it had elsewhere, because it's not so much about a collective, all society consciousness. But nevertheless, it is bound up with a whole load of those things. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing, one of the weaknesses of many churches now, and perhaps particularly of evangelicalism, is that its individualism has become so pronounced that it's produced the phenomenon of loads of people who call themselves Christians don't go to church, or they they do virtual church online, or something like this, or they have quirky beliefs that may not be the official belief of the church they belong to at all. Right. So, well, in that case, I suppose Durkheim would say, well, they are part of the phenomenon I'm describing. The whole thing is kind of collapsing under individualism.
And it doesn't sound like he has a very favorable view on
Oh, no, no.
religion. Would he would he have been influenced by Marxism?
That's a question above my pay grade, I think. I think he, I think he might have been, but I'm not sure of it. Somewhere upstairs in my vast library, I've got the volume The Dissuaders, which is talking about people trying to dissuade people from religious belief. And it's about three thinkers, him and Marx and one other, I can't remember who he was now. So he's certainly in a category with Marx. Whether he's actually influenced by him, I can't remember, I'm sorry. But I'm sure I will be corrected and put straight on this by commenters in the box, although as the really good people who put comments, either favourable or unfavourable, under our podcasts will have observed, lots and lots of the people who leave comments clearly haven't looked at the podcast at all, but have been triggered, as the language now goes, by the title or something like that. But please, if you can help us out here, please do so. And even if you think I'm making a bad job on this point, that's fine. You've watched this far. Thank you. Okay, well, let's come now to this other key figure, whom again we mentioned in a previous series, Max Weber, who, remember, is famous really for making the connection between Protestantism and the capitalist ethic. And he spoke of secularization as being the disenchantment of the world. And again, that's another way of talking about what Guinness mentioned, which is this distinction between final cause and proximate cause, and religion being functionally irrelevant. Well, let's just take a gulp of fresh air here, given that we're getting down to some of these people, with C.S. Lewis, by whom nobody can be uncheered. I think I borrowed that one from Winnie the Pooh. Anyway, so undoubtedly my favourite philosopher. Right. So C.S. Lewis comments on what disenchantment of the world actually means. He says, now I take it, when we understand a thing analytically and then dominate and use it for our own convenience, we reduce it to the level of nature, in the sense that we suspend our judgments of value about it, ignore its final cause, if any, and treat it in terms of quantity. So we treat it as a mere material thing. disenchanted then. This repression of elements in what would otherwise be our total reaction to it is sometimes very noticeable and even painful. Something has to be overcome before we can cut up a dead man or a live animal in a dissecting room. Now, he's referring there to the ways in which, for example, lots of knowledge of anatomy came from the Renaissance and early modern period, cutting up the bodies of dead criminals, or sometimes, beggars or people who had died under sad circumstances. And that was often illegal in some countries, and it was kind of done secretively, but the knowledge was gained by it, and we all benefit from that today. But perhaps a lot more contentious in our own time and in his would be vivisection, cutting up animals still alive to make medical experiments, or even worse, to develop new perfumes and all this kind of appalling stuff. And he says that something has to be overcome in us before we can do those things that causes us to suppress all those elements that we know about the animal or about the human being, and to treat it as mere matter. These objects resist the movement of the mind, whereby we thrust them into the world of mere nature. But in other instances, too, a similar price is exacted for our analytical knowledge and manipulative power, even if we've ceased to count it. We do not look at trees either as dryads or as beautiful objects while we cut them into beams. The first man who did so may have felt the price keenly, and the bleeding trees in Virgil and Spenser may be far off echoes of that primeval sense of impiety. There's Lewis, the literature professor, telling us. The stars lost their divinity as astronomy developed, and the dying god has no place in chemical agriculture. To many, no doubt, this process is simply the gradual discovery that the real world is different from what we expected, and the old opposition to Galileo or to body snatchers is simply obscurantism. But that's not the whole story. So he's not denying that that's part of it, partly true, but he's saying it's not the whole story. It's not the greatest of modern scientists who feel most sure that the object, stripped of its qualitative properties and reduced to mere quantity, is wholly real. Little scientists and little unscientific followers of science may think so. The great minds know very well that the object so treated is an artificial abstraction, that something of its reality has been lost. Now, this is just to cut in here. This is true not only of sciences, it's true, I would maintain, of almost all disciplines, academic disciplines, including mine, that they tend to be reductionist, right? So the chemist might insist that Coel is 9 parts water, which is A, true, and B, an outrage, because there's rather more to it than that, right? But the same thing is true of other sort of non-science, social sciences, for example, like history, that we can reduce things simply to sociological phenomena. I mean, I have been castigated once or twice by a number of pious Christians for my approach to church history, because we're not leaving any room for the role of the Holy Spirit. I hope that's not the case, but what I'm doing is showing how measurably things happened, or doctrines changed, or church bodies developed over time, or the circumstances under which revivals happened, or something like that, right? But I'm not saying, at least I hope I'm not saying, that's the sum total of the explanation. But the tendency of academic disciplines is in that direction, reductionist. So from this point of view, Lewis says, the conquest of nature appears in a new light. We reduce things to mere nature in order that we may conquer them. We're always conquering nature because nature is the name for what we have, to some extent, conquered. The price of conquest is to treat a thing as mere nature. That is, to be reductionist about it and to ignore final cause in favour of proximate cause.
It sounds like he's saying we've lost kind of our romantic sensibilities on our path to conquer the world or modernize, right? Like he wasn't really a fan of
No, he
modernization, if
refused.
I recall
Yes,
correctly.
you're quite right. He wasn't. I'm not sure I would want to put it that way though, because if it's mere romanticism, it's very difficult for us, well, even for me, not to take the other side of this and say, well, that's mere romanticism, right? Um, I think that the ultra pragmatists or people tending towards materialism would tend to say, oh, this is just so much romantic stuff. And do I think that Lewis was affected by
Mhm.
romanticism? Yes, I do. But do I think that practically everybody since the late 18th century has been affected by romanticism? Yes, I'm completely certain of it. So, I don't, yeah, sorry, I'm just quite unfairly grabbing at one word that you use there and saying, no, I wish you used another one. Let's move on and get back to some of these theorizers. Wilson, we need to mention. Now, he was someone I had come across decades ago. And when I went to do my postgrad work in Oxford, one of the really exciting things about that is when you're there, you can just crash in on any lectures anywhere in the university, even way outside of your discipline or your program or anything like that, just because they're interesting and they're there and they're all these fantastic people teaching there. So I thought, Brian Wilson, he's teaching. I'm going to go and crash in on some of his lectures, as I did. He's very, very good. Although I did get the impression that he was a slightly he had a slightly weaselly, knowing demeanour that I found a bit off-putting. But it's pretty terrible speaking like this for the poor man's been dead for 20 years now. Okay, he's a sociologist of religion, and he certainly is kind of reductionist. The book that perhaps he was most famous for, or certainly the one that I knew about, was concerning religious sects. His most famous book is the one we mentioned here, Religion in Secular Society. And he argues, this is way back in 1966, when he would have been just born, that he saw there were six principal causes of secularization. Ascetic Protestantism that promoted rationalist and pragmatic ethics.
A strong Catholic argument has been that Protestantism was simply a stage on the way to secularism. So is Wilson agreeing with the Catholics?
Yeah, I mean, he was a secular person himself, but yeah, I think he would agree with that. And in fact, it's kind of hard to disagree with him on this point. Yeah, because Catholicism more than Orthodoxy, but Protestantism more than Catholicism is individualist. So and a lot of this process of secularization is about the growing emphasis upon the individual, which we have now, as we see all around us every day, or within ourselves, we've taken to lunatic extremes. But Protestantism is part of that process, yes. He also thinks that the rational organization of society, state, and organization contribute towards this, what he calls societalization. So let's think about this now. Think about a lot of political discussion, leaving the mad guys out of account now. Let's think about the sensible political actors and contributors, right? And they talk about our society in rather abstract and rationalist terms. Take an idea like the economy, right? Well, everybody talks about the state of the economy and how do we make it better or fairer or more dynamic or whatever it is, right? How do we raise average productivity? These kinds of things. That whole way of thinking is a product of modernity, right? Until the late 18th century, I'm guessing, and even then only in a few countries, nobody talked about the economy in that way. It wasn't that they didn't have ideas about it, but mostly it was at the level of how can the king or whoever's governing obtain the highest tax revenues without driving away the trade that produces the tax revenues, or something like that. That it's at that kind of level of major actors within what we now call the economy, rather than the economy as a whole. So we've moved towards this kind of rational organization. The development of social and natural sciences again, is part of that same sort of process. We now think of society in the way that we do now, as an abstract conception that we might want to make like this or take care of like that, and so on. And this, again, is the rise of rationalist ideologies, which we'll be spending a lot of time on over the next few weeks. So we look at them individually. The development of technology and industry, which again depend upon treating raw materials and even people, even workers, as things. Workers become like input into production. So we're treating people as things. Or if you're selling stuff, they become consumers, right? Not Coel and Mike, right? But as potential consumers for whatever it is that we're selling. So we're treating, again, people as things. And the rise of cities and their importance, which even medieval churchmen, much to our hilarity these days when we read what they had to say, but they saw truly, in a sense, that cities were also secularizing because they increased the levels of individualism. People could make their own way in the world. They loosened ties to parish churches and so on.
And these are all causes of secularization, he's saying, but I feel like you could also say these are effects of secularization as well.
Yes, the whole thing is like a spiral feeding upon
Right.
itself. Why does the very idea of an established religion come to seem intolerable? Because these processes have already started to play themselves out, and this now seems like a defunct constraint. And so the American revolutionaries decide, well, we're not going to have this, and even those states in Europe that have them, they progressively strip uh, the official religions of their power as they open things up to other people outside of those structures, and so on. Yes, yes. So the whole thing is like feeding upon itself. Yeah. Well, let's come to this man now, Peter Berger. He was an Austrian American sociologist um, who is sometimes considered to be a theologian in his own right, although he says very mischievously in his delightfully entitled book, A Rumour of Angels, that uh, he can't. He's never been able to hit upon the name of the heresy to which he himself subscribes, even though he'd want to call himself a Christian. Well, but he's writing here in the early 1960s, and he says if commentators on the contemporary situation of religion agree about anything, it is that the supernatural has departed from the modern world. This departure may be stated in such dramatic formulations as God is dead or the post Christian era. This means that those to whom the supernatural is a meaningful reality still find themselves in the status of a cognitive minority.
And what do we mean by cognitive minority?
Cognitive is to do with knowing. So religious believers, even if they don't know the expression, they nevertheless see themselves as knowing stuff that the people around them don't know and seeing the world in a different kind of way. That could be true of any cognitive minority. In this case, we're talking here about religious believers, right? They know the world around them functions on different principles to those which they themselves want to acknowledge. Although, as we see, of course, we are strongly drawn by the dominant ethos, the dominant cognicity. Is that a word? I guess it is now. But whilst nevertheless wanting to hang on to the religious beliefs that make them a cognitive minority. And he says this is a very important
Right.
consequence with very far-reaching implications. I mean, because it's going to affect the psychology of religious believers, right? Because they see themselves in a very different light in the society in which they live as at least partial outsiders. The theologian more and more resembles a witch doctor stranded among logical positivists. Or, of course, a logical positivist stranded among witch doctors, which is a delicious piece of humour.
And maybe we'll define logical positivism as
Okay, well,
well.
logical positivism it was a dominant form of philosophy in Western universities from, say, the late 1940s through to the 1960s, something like that. And basically, it was a kind of a defining philosophy, and what it maintained was that the only meaningful statements a human being could utter were those that could be quantified or measured or physically verified. So, on their view, I mean, they would be the starting point for what we could call hard agnosticism. An agnostic is a person who doesn't know whether there's God. Well, a soft agnostic, I like to divide them into two categories. A soft agnostic merely says, I don't know. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. The hard agnostic says, you cannot know, it cannot be known. And generally, something like logical positivism is the philosophy at their back. It's saying, this is not a meaningful statement. But then, there is no God is also not a meaningful statement. So, right. So that was very influential at the time he was writing that book. It's got a bit of an afterlife, I suppose, even though I think probably very few philosophers would sign up to that today. But before our story takes a slightly different turn here, let's pay attention to a book that came out in 2002 by a British sociologist, Callum Brown. And he argues in The Death of Christian Britain that secularisation has in fact been recent. It didn't start with the 18th century and keep on progressing from then. It's been recent and sudden. In his view, it was the 1960s that saw a decisive break. And he argues this was when most people ceased to perceive themselves as Christians.
Is Brown's argument about the 1960s connected with the decade of the sexual revolution by any
Yes, it
chance?
is. It is. And I think he's got an important point. I'm not comfortable with his book because a lot of his argumentation is highly subjective. And it's almost as though he's ignoring all of the kind of structural stuff around cities, changing laws, and the way in which functionally ordinary people's lives were much more secular from the late 18th century onwards, let's say. But if he is on to an important point, the 1960s see the sexual revolution with, let us say, rather drastic changes in people's behaviour, one of the consequences of which was that loads of people no longer perceived themselves to be Christian. So before this time, he said, well, it would be common ground with him and all the rest of us. Before this time, loads of people would have called themselves Christians, even if they rarely went to church, maybe just Christmas, Easter, got married in church, maybe had their, if they were, Anglican, Presbyterian, Catholic, something like this, they probably have their babies christened. That kind of thing obviously is not going to be true of the Baptistic churches. And so whether in some kind of self-delusion, but at least it's a statement about how they perceive themselves, saw themselves as Christians. And he's saying that the advent of the Beatles and the pill caused women in particular to stop giving Christianity their vote of confidence in the 1960s. And that everything has sort of followed from that. So I think he's right in terms of the way that people perceive their own lives. I think that it's a mistake to jettison all the other stuff that everybody else has pointed to. I think quite rightly that this process has been going on for 200 years. But the 1960s is certainly a very important decade. And here's an advance advert for people. We will be devoting another mini series to that topic at some stage in the next few months.
So, all of these people that we've been talking about have been talking about the process of secularization happening, but now we're going to switch and see sort of the opposite.
Well, yes. From the late 20th century, a number of people started pointing out that secularization was going into reverse, that we're seeing de-secularization. And the most famous and perhaps important book of this kind is by Gilles Kepel, a French political scientist, a specialist on the Arab world. And his 1994 book was a bestseller, La Revanche de Dieu, The Revenge of God, completely changed the conversation about secularization. Societies, he said, were desecularizing.
So he's actually going to say that religion is on the rise and becoming important again.
Yes, yes. Now, as an outlier for this, back in the 1960s, I seem to remember, I think it was Marshall McLuhan said that we're about to enter a profoundly religious age. Maybe this is what he was referring to. I think this has actually been a blip, a very big blip, a very big blip in the long trajectory, but I don't think it has completely reversed everything. But it must be attended to, and we're going to be pointing out things that everybody watching this will be very well aware of, and we'll just be kind of putting them in order. So, what Keppel says is around 1975, secularization went into reverse. A new religious approach took shape, aimed no longer at adapting to secular values, but recovering a sacred foundation for the organization of society by changing society, if necessary. The theme was no longer aggiornamento. Now, aggiornamento was the watchword of the Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 65. That is bringing Catholicism up to date, up to oggi, the giorno, the day, right? But so instead of trying to do that and to adapt to the values of secular society, on the converse, to go for a second evangelization of Europe. Now, that makes sense when we think of how Pope John the 23rd, who called the Second Vatican Council, and Paul VI, who saw it to a conclusion and was Pope for a number of years afterwards, how they were, and this is not to disparage them at all, the first of those in particular was a great man, how they were concerned to adapt the Catholic Church to the realities of the modern world. And golly, they needed to. The Catholic Church in particular had just come out of a nightmare 160 years, let's say. But that gives way to Pope John Paul II in 1978, and then his successor, Pope Benedict XVI, who are doing in some ways quite the opposite. They're wanting to give a slightly harder edge to Catholicism in confronting the modern world. So the theme's no longer aggiornamento, but a second evangelization of Europe. The aim was no longer to modernize Islam, but to Islamize modernity. And the late 1970s and even more the 1980s was the time when, for example, Arab nationalism, and nationalism is a modern Western secular force in the Arab world, was completely sidelined in favor of Islamism. Right? So, Islamizing modernity. From Cairo or Algiers to Prague, from the American evangelicals to the zealots of Gush Emunim, from Islamic militants to Catholic charismatics, from the Lubavitch to Communion and Liberation, the conservative Catholic movement in Italy, there is a burgeoning movement. Our working hypothesis will be that what these movements say and do is meaningful and does not spring from a dethronement of reason or from a manipulation of hidden forces. Rather, it's the undeniable evidence of a deep malaise in society that can no longer be interpreted in terms of our traditional categories of thought. Now, this is ironic here because by traditional, here means our traditionally modern rationalist categories of thought. Right?
Right.
And he's saying this is coming from the fact that these have led us to a dead end. And so there's a renewal of religion for these reasons. Taking them seriously, these movements seriously, does not, however, make us either into their advocates or their fellow travellers. He's wanting to show his credentials as a good modernist, rationalist, secularist there, right? He's saying, I'm not on their side, I'm just describing what's going on. Any more than a person whose eyes had been opened to the condition of the proletariat by reading communist literature had to become a member of the party. So he's like, I'm not becoming one of them. I'm just trying to explain what's going on. These movements are the true children of our time, unwanted children of computerization and unemployment, or of the population explosion and increasing literacy. Like the workers' movement of yesteryear, today's religious movements reveal the ills of society for which they have their own diagnosis. I mean, that's most acutely seen, of course, in the Arab world, where conditions in Arab countries were getting worse and worse. And the Islamists' line was, these Western style Arab nationalist dictators have done nothing for us and just making our conditions worse. Islam is the answer. Aha, right? But at a more individualist and psychological level, something similar is true of the upsurge in conservative Catholicism and evangelicalism in America, for example.
So he's saying here that religion is becoming popular again as a way of dealing with these modern problems.
Yes, yes. So just assemble a few pictures here, just to kind of summarise these. We've got Pope Benedict XVI there, a far more conservative Pope, not than his immediate predecessor, but the predecessors before that. Oral Roberts over on the top right there, the American healer, evangelist, preacher, who kind of epitomizes the upward surge in popular evangelicalism in the late 20th century in America. Bottom left, we've got Ayatollah Khomeini with adoring crowds in Iran. I mean, this is the first Islamist revolution in Iran in 1979. And then we've got a picture of a whole load of ultra Orthodox Jews in, I think it's in Mea Shearim in Jerusalem, confronted by some of the security forces. So their sheer numbers and their conflicting demands are causing problems. My
Yeah.
sense is that this has actually died down a bit now, and that secularization has resumed. Not everywhere. We'll come back to this in a minute. Perhaps we should really pay attention to one of the most influential living theorists on secularization theory, and this is Charles Taylor, a very nice Canadian Catholic. And he argues that reform movements in Christendom, and this is his very gentle, nice way of referring to the Reformation, aimed at intensifying individual spiritual experience and devotion, which of course they did. That's what they aimed at. But led to heightened individualism, which ironically unraveled the fabric of public religion, the stuff that Durkheim was talking about in the early 20th century. You know, it's a form of collective consciousness. Unraveled the fabric of public religion and led, in the long run, to secularity. Now, the trend, he argues, was offset before 1960 by successful popular Christian movements that stressed voluntary participation, whether those are evangelical or popular Catholic movements, particularly in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. But since the sexual revolution of the 1960s, we're back on Callum Brown's territory again, this in turn has eroded. So the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, Taylor contends, and this is in one of his two most famous books, A Secular Age, which is an absolute, to say a breeze block, what's the American term? A cinder block of a book that's like, you know, that's pretty massive, but it's good. He argues that the Cultural Revolution of the 60s brought the age of mobilization, that is, of popular participatory movements, to an end, not immediately, but gradually, and ushered in a culture of personal authenticity and expressive individualism, in which obviously we are still deeply mired.
This is all about like the final rejection of socially imposed roles and identities, right? Like about living out who you feel yourself to be, like the live your truth kind of a
Yes,
slogan.
yes, live your truth. Who am I really? Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the whole idea of that we are somehow being authentic by giving vent to whatever we feel like doing. Yes, I mean, I could really go on a long rant about this. I'm going to have to restrain myself. I mean, but I would say that this has not made us more free or more authentic. All it's done is greatly diminish our dignity. Okay, but this all makes participation in religious bodies not necessarily redundant, but highly contingent. So, as we mentioned before, with churches, people go when they feel like, don't go when they feel like. They don't necessarily go along with the line of the churches to which they belong, and so on. Yeah, and individuals' religious expressions are highly idiosyncratic, right? Just to illustrate this, if you meet someone from a church and find out what denomination it is, your knowledge of the distinctives of that denomination doesn't mean that that person thinks all those things. That's only marginally more likely than random, right? Simply because a person says they're a Presbyterian doesn't necessarily these days mean they're a Calvinist, right? Just because somebody says they're a Methodist doesn't mean that they don't believe a whole load of things that would have John Wesley spinning in his grave. And not, I mean, anyway, you could choose any. Forgive me, members of those denominations, we could have chosen any others at random, but you get the general idea, right? So we're all,
Yes.
yeah, everything is about being personally authentic, and so on. So to survive in this environment, denominations have to become internally very pluralist, and that certainly is true in the long run with denominations. They start off on some kind of platform, some given set of ideas that seem important to them and their leaders and their immediate followers. But with the passing of time, and you can see this in any of the major denominations, if you go to their headquarters or their colleges, you can find that actually they've become extremely internally pluralist. And the loyalty is not necessarily to the original program, but merely to the organization. And we're becoming less and less loyal to organizations all the time. Okay, so to wrap this up, has the religious upsurge of the 1970s to 2000s tailed off? I would want to argue that not in every respect, but in most, it has. The powerful Catholic resurgence in post-communist countries, Poland, Slovakia, Croatia, has tailed off and is being replaced by a drift, probably slower in Poland than in Croatia, but nevertheless a drift in the direction of Belgium and Spain, to being merely culturally Catholic, but much lower rates of participation. The evangelical resurgence in the US has foundered on overreach, and it's been replaced by particularly therapeutic pseudo evangelicalism about meeting your felt needs, about God looking after what you want to do in your career, and this kind of stuff. And by postmodern forms of theological liberalism. So, particularly over at sexual ethics. So, whereas the modernist liberal theology said, well, either the Bible or the Christian tradition is incorrect at this point, and this point, and this point, postmodern liberalism says, well, there's no need even to go into those arguments. These texts can be interpreted any way we happen to choose, which is very tricky for dealing with. Radical Islamism is certainly still alive and strong and sometimes dangerous, but my sense is that it's slowly retreating, as indeed Sam Huntington in The Clash of Civilizations predicted it would. He said that the radical Islamism was connected with a youth spike, which demographically would peak out in 2015 and it would slowly diminish thereafter. And I think he was right. In Iran, admittedly an extreme example, Islamism is utterly discredited in the eyes of most citizens. And I've seen reports that indicate that at least 50%, probably more, of the population would not wish to identify even as Muslim, which is quite shocking, really. But in Israel, and my sense is, and please, if viewers know better, correct me on this point, in India, the turn to greater religiosity still seems to be in full flood. So it's a mixed kind of a picture.
In our last episode and in our series on apologetics, I feel like you and Justin Brierley were mentioning that Britain might be, in your words, turning a corner, so to speak, towards more religious conversions. So is that like sort of an anomaly then?
Yes, and I don't think either he or I expect this to be a sudden inrush, but by golly, how we'd love to be wrong. But at least
Right.
bottoming out at a pretty low level and hopefully turning some kind of a corner. Although, as I indicated, even if that turns out really well, I expect that the kind of Christianity and the kind of churches that will emerge will look almost nothing like what we're used to and what existing generations of Christians even would be comfortable with. I think it's going to look
Right.
very different.
Yeah, so as we have seen in this episode, as the world continues to evolve, the church continues to evolve as well,
Yes,
maybe.
yes, yes. Well, what we've done here, and I'm sure people are now, completely bloated on sociology of religion. So we're going to sort of tie a bow around this one at the end. And in following episodes, we're going to be coming back to the kind of topics that people would more naturally expect to look at, like the rise of Enlightenment rationalism in the 18th century, modernist ideologies. We'll be looking particularly at nationalism and socialism. We'll be looking at the rise of biblical criticism in the late 19th century. We'll be looking at changes in science and Darwinism. We're going to resist the temptation to look at Christian reactions to that because we want to look at that in another series. But we're going to be looking at all of those things which have certainly contributed towards secularization. So, yes, stay with us, folks, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
Yes, and don't forget to share on social media and just blast our message to everyone that you know, because the more people that we can brainwash, the better.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Okay. Bye bye now, everybody.